You learned feudalism died somewhere between the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. Your textbooks told you serfs became free workers, lords became businessmen, land grants became stock portfolios. The medieval world faded into museums and Renaissance fairs. This is a lie, not a simplification, not a misunderstanding, a lie. Feudalism did not end, it upgraded. The castles became corporate headquarters, the lords became shareholders, the serfs became renters, and the rent extraction, the land concentration, the hereditary wealth, the labor dependency, the limited mobility, all of it survived. The Federal Reserve documents it. The UK Land Registry confirms it. Economists at the Paris School of Economics have tracked it across 2 centuries. The system you live inside right now operates on the same logic as a 12th century manor. You work land you do not own. You pay rent to people whose great-great-grandfathers received their holdings through royal decree. You build wealth for families whose names appear on documents signed by medieval kings. The flow of money moves upward. The flow of labor moves downward. The machinery of extraction runs on different fuel but produces the same output. This is noob historian. History has owners. We name them. The reason this matters to you is simple. Your rent check, your stagnant wages, your inability to buy a home, your children's diminished prospects. These are not market failures. These are not policy accidents. These are the predictable outcomes of an 800-year-old system designed to concentrate assets in hereditary hands and extract rent from everyone else. Understanding this system is the first step towards seeing your own position within it. You are not a free market participant making choices. You are a modern serf operating inside a structure built before Columbus reached the Americas. The data proves it. The documents exist. The receipts are public. Let us examine them. Every Western education system teaches the same story. Feudalism emerged in the early medieval period as a response to the collapse of Roman central authority. Kings granted land to nobles. Nobles granted protection to peasants. Peasants worked the land. Everyone had obligations to everyone else. Then capitalism arrived, cities grew, markets expanded, and feudalism gradually disappeared between 1400 and 1800. This narrative contains one accurate statement. Feudalism did emerge from the collapse of Roman authority. Everything else ranges from oversimplification to fabrication. The core structures of feudalism were never dismantled. They were renamed. Consider the 5 defining features of feudal economics. First, concentrated land ownership in hereditary hands. Second, rent extraction from those who work the land to those who own it. Third, wealth transmission through bloodline rather than merit. Fourth, labor dependency, where workers need lords more than lords need individual workers. Fifth, limited mobility, where birth determines economic position. Now examine documented evidence from 2024. The UK Land Registry and the research compiled by Guy Shrubsole in 2019 produced the first comprehensive analysis of English land ownership since 1872. The findings: 25,000 landowners control 50% of England. This represents 0.04% of the population. 1/3 of English land remains in the hands of aristocratic families who received it through medieval grants. The Duchy of Lancaster, owned by the Crown, holds 45,000 hectares. The Duchy of Cornwall holds 52,000 hectares. These holdings trace directly to grants made by medieval monarchs. The paperwork changed. The ownership did not. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances tracks American wealth distribution with precision. The 2022 survey documented the top 1% of American households holding 31.4% of total household wealth. The bottom 50% holds 2.6%, but the inheritance data proves the feudal parallel. Among the top 10% of wealth holders, 21% of their assets derive from inheritance. This proportion grew by 8 percentage points since 1989. Wealth concentrates, wealth inherits. The pattern matches medieval succession. Thomas Piketty and the World Inequality Lab assembled data from tax records, estate records, and national accounts across 100 countries spanning 1820 to present. Their finding describes a U-shaped curve. Wealth concentration in 2020 approaches levels last measured in 1910. The top 10% wealth share in the United States reached 71% in 2021. This exceeds the 1910 peak of 68%. The compression of the mid-20th century, when wars and progressive taxation reduced inequality, was the historical anomaly. The current concentration represents a return to normal, and normal means feudal. Your textbook described an evolution from feudalism to capitalism. The data describes a temporary interruption, followed by restoration. The Enclosure Acts of the 15th through 18th centuries represent the largest land theft in English history. Parliament transferred common lands, which peasant communities had farmed collectively for centuries, into private aristocratic ownership. The legal mechanism was simple. Lords claimed the land was inefficient. Parliament agreed. Peasants lost access. Former commoners became landless laborers, forced to sell their work for wages. Historians present this as the birth of capitalism. They describe the creation of a labor market, the shift from subsistence farming to wage work, the foundations of industrial society. This framing obscures what happened. A small class seized productive assets from a large class and then charged the large class for access. The Enclosure Acts did not create capitalism. They created a landlord class with permanent leverage over a landless class. The land never changed hands again. The Return of Owners of Land, compiled in 1872 and nicknamed the New Domesday Book, documented English land ownership for the first time since William the Conqueror's 1086 survey. It found 4,217 individuals owned 50% of England. Guy Shrubsole's 2019 research found 25,000 individuals own 50% of England today. The percentage increased slightly. The structure remained identical. Shrubsole traced ownership records and identified families whose holdings derived from medieval grants. The Duke of Westminster owns 133,000 acres in England and Scotland. The Grosvenor family acquired the original London estates through a 1677 marriage, but the family's aristocratic status and landholding patterns trace to the Norman conquest. The Duke of Northumberland holds 100,000 acres through the Percy family, whose land grants date to 1309. The Earl of Devon holds land continuously since 1086, documented in the original Domesday Book. These are not anecdotes, these are property records. The United States presents a different but parallel pattern. America had no medieval aristocracy, but the concentration of land ownership followed similar trajectories through different mechanisms. The 1862 Homestead Act promised 160 acres to settlers. In practice, railroad companies, land speculators, and agricultural corporations acquired the majority of Western land. The 2022 Land Report documented 100 families owning 42 million acres of American land. The top landowner, the Emerson family, holds 2.4 million acres. John Malone holds 2.2 million acres. Ted Turner holds 2 million acres. 40 families control an area larger than New England. The mechanisms differ between medieval England and modern America. The outcomes match. A small class holds the land. Everyone else pays for access. A medieval serf kept approximately 50% of their harvest. The lord took the rest through direct extraction, labor obligations, and fees for using mills, oviding, and other facilities. The serf retained enough to survive. The lord retained enough to maintain power. The arrangement persisted because serfs had no alternatives. Leaving meant starvation or outlaw status. The system trapped through dependency. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks real wages for American production and non-supervisory workers. Real wages measure purchasing power adjusted for inflation. In 1973, the real wage for this category stood at $11.45 per hour in constant 1982-1984 dollars. In 2023, the real wage stood at $11.19 per hour in the same constant dollars. 50 years, zero progress, slight decline. During the same period, productivity per worker increased 64.6%. Workers produced more. Workers received less. The difference flowed upward. The housing burden data completes the picture. The Census Bureau American Community Survey documents housing costs as a percentage of income. In 2023, 50.4% of American renters paid more than 30% of their income on housing. This is the official threshold for cost burdened. Another 26.4% paid more than 50% of their income on housing. This is severely cost burdened. Combine these figures. Workers earn wages with the same purchasing power as 1973. Housing consumes a larger share of those wages than at any point since measurement began in 1960. The ratio of median home price to median household income reached 7.5 to 1 in 2023. In 1980, this ratio stood at 3.2 to 1. The serf kept half their harvest and surrendered the rest to the lord. The modern renter keeps less. The mathematics confirm it. If your rent consumes 50% of your income, and your income buys no more than a 1973 income, you surrender more to your landlord than a medieval peasant surrendered to their feudal superior. The serf had one advantage you lack. The serf held a legal claim to remain on the land. The serf could not be evicted at the lord's convenience. The modern renter holds a month-to-month lease and faces eviction for failure to pay. Matthew Desmond's research through the Princeton Eviction Lab documented American eviction rates. In high-poverty neighborhoods, 1 in 8 renters face eviction filing annually. The threat of removal creates compliance. Workers accept worse conditions because the alternative is homelessness. The feudal bond tied serf to land and lord to obligation. The modern bond ties renter to lease and landlord to nothing. The leverage increased, the extraction increased, the system became more feudal, not less. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered the largest transfer of residential real estate from individual owners to institutional investors in recorded history. This was not a market correction. This was an enclosure. Redfin, the real estate brokerage, tracks institutional investor purchases. In Q1 2022, institutional investors purchased 18% of all single-family homes sold. In 2010, this figure stood at 2%. The increase represents a 900% shift in 12 years. The names behind these purchases reveal the concentration. Blackstone, the private equity firm, operates Invitation Homes, the largest single-family rental company in America. Invitation Homes owns over 80,000 houses. Starwood Capital and American Homes are 4 rent-owned comparable portfolios. Collectively, private equity firms now own over 500,000 single-family rental homes. This mirrors the Enclosure Acts with precision. In medieval and early modern England, Parliament transferred common lands to private aristocratic ownership through legal mechanisms. In 2020 to 2024, Capital Advantage transferred middle-class housing stock to institutional ownership through market mechanisms. The legal form differed. The economic result matched. Consider what happened. Before the transfer, a family owned a home. They built equity. They had security of tenure. They could borrow against the asset. They could pass it to their children. After the transfer, a corporation owns the home. The family rents. They build no equity. They have no security beyond the lease term. They cannot borrow against an asset they do not own. They pass nothing to their children except the obligation to rent from the same class of owners. The UK documents the same pattern with longer data. The term generation rent describes the cohort locked out of ownership. In 1991, 67% of British adults aged 25 to 34 owned their homes. In 2021, 41% did. A majority of young adults became permanent tenants. Their position parallels the 18th century commoners displaced by enclosure. They work, they pay rent, they own nothing. They depend on landlords whose power grows with each percentage point of market share gained. Matthew Desmond, the Princeton sociologist, calculated the cumulative effect. American renters paid $4.5 trillion in rent over the 2010-2020 decade. This was the largest wealth transfer from lower income to higher income households in American history. The money moved from people who worked for wages to people who owned assets. The flow direction matched feudalism. IRS income data and census housing statistics document this. The transfer is not theoretical. The government tracked it in real time. The economist Yanis Varoufakis argues capitalism ended. What replaced it operates on feudal logic. His book, Techno-Feudalism, describes the structure. In capitalism, companies compete by producing goods and services for markets. Consumers choose. Competition drives down prices. Innovation drives up quality. Capital flows to productive enterprise. In techno-feudalism, platforms own the infrastructure everyone else must use. Amazon owns the marketplace. Google owns the search gateway. Apple and Google own the mobile ecosystems. Facebook owns the social graph. These platforms do not compete in markets. They own the markets. They extract rent from everyone who operates within their territory. Consider Amazon. Third-party sellers using Amazon Marketplace pay Amazon between 25% and 45% of each sale in fees, fulfillment costs, and advertising required for visibility. This is rent extraction. The sellers produce value. Amazon collects tribute for access to customers. Amazon does not make most of the products it sells. Amazon owns the land the products must cross. This is the digital equivalent of a feudal toll bridge. The Lord built nothing. The Lord owns the crossing point. Everyone pays. Google operates the same structure. Businesses pay for Google Ads to reach customers searching for their products. Google collected $224 billion in advertising revenue in 2022. This money came from businesses paying for access to their own potential customers. Google produced no goods. Google controlled the gateway. Brett Christophers, the economic geographer, documented rentier activities in the UK economy. His book Rentier Capitalism calculated that 27% of UK corporate profits derive from rent extraction rather than production. This includes land rents, resource rents, financial intermediation fees, and intellectual property licensing. More than a quarter of corporate profit comes not from making things, but from owning things and charging access fees. The feudal economy worked the same way. Lords did not produce. Lords owned, peasants produced, peasants paid. The technology sector accelerated this pattern. Software patents, platform monopolies, and network effects created new forms of enclosure. The digital commons, the open internet of the 1990s, is enclosed. The platforms own it. Users and businesses pay tribute for access. Guy Standing, the economist who coined the term precariat, documented the labor side of this transformation. The precariat describes a class of workers with no job security, no benefits, no pension, no career ladder, and no bargaining power. Gig workers, contract workers, temp workers, 0-hours employees. This class grew from approximately 15% of the workforce in 1980 to over 40% by 2020 across Western economies. The precariat holds the economic position of pre-union industrial workers. They sell labor at whatever price the market offers. They have no leverage. They depend on employers who owe them nothing beyond the immediate transaction. The serf depended on the lord but held rights the lord had to respect. The precariat worker depends on platforms and employers who hold no reciprocal obligations. The dependency increased. The rights decreased. Michael Hudson, the economist and historian, traced debt structures across 5,000 years. His research documented a pattern. Concentrated wealth generates concentrated lending power. Lending creates debt. Debt creates dependency. Dependency creates extraction. Extraction concentrates wealth further. The cycle accelerates until the entire productive economy services debt obligations to the ownership class. Bronze Age societies understood this. Mesopotamian kings declared jubilees, canceling debts and freeing debt slaves to reset the system. Biblical law prescribed jubilees every 50 years. Ancient lawmakers recognized debt concentration as an existential threat to social stability. Modern economies remove the reset mechanism. Debt accumulates, debt inherits. The Federal Reserve documents household debt at $17.5 trillion in Q3 2024. Student debt alone exceeds $1.7 trillion. Mortgage debt exceeds $12 trillion. Medical debt affects 100 million Americans. The debt structure creates the same dependency as feudal obligation. You must work to service debt. You must accept available wages to service debt. You must maintain housing to service debt. The chain of obligation binds you to the system. Piketty documented the underlying mechanism with a formula, R greater than G. This means returns on capital exceed the growth rate of the economy. When capital returns exceed economic growth, wealth concentrates automatically. The owners of existing wealth capture a larger share of new production than workers capture through wages. Over time, ownership concentrates toward mathematical limits. The mid-20th century interrupted this pattern through 2 world wars, progressive taxation, strong unions, and regulatory intervention. Capital took losses. Inheritance taxes reduced transfers. Workers gained bargaining power. The compression was real. The reversal began in 1973. Nixon ended Bretton Woods. Reagan cut top tax rates from 70% to 28%. Thatcher privatized public assets. Unions declined from 35% of the private workforce in 1955 to 6% in 2022. Financial deregulation accelerated after 1999. The system restored itself. The policy choices were not accidents. Joel Kotkin documented the process in The Coming of Neo-Feudalism. Donor class interests shaped tax policy, labor policy, and housing policy. The results matched donor interests. The mechanism was documented campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, and revolving door employment between regulatory agencies and regulated industries. The system protects itself because the people who benefit from the system control the policy levers. This is not conspiracy. This is documented political economy. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances tracks the results generationally. Millennials at age 35 hold 5% of American household wealth. Baby boomers at age 35 held 21%. The transfer already happened. The enclosure completed. A generation entered adulthood to find the housing stock enclosed, the job market precarious, and the debt load preassigned. Conclusion. The historical question was never whether feudalism ended. The question was whether the ownership class would voluntarily surrender structural advantages accumulated over 8 centuries. The answer documented by the Federal Reserve, the UK Land Registry, the World Inequality Database, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Census Bureau is no. The advantages persisted. The land ownership persisted. The rent extraction persisted. The hereditary wealth transfer persisted. The labor dependency persisted. The limited mobility persisted. The vocabulary changed. Lord became landlord. Serf became renter. Tithe became rent payment. Manor became corporation. Royal grant became capital accumulation. Feudal obligation became mortgage obligation. The structure remained. The money still flows upward. The labor still flows downward. The leverage still concentrates. The dependency still binds. You exist inside this system. Your rent check funds it. Your wages service it. Your debt sustains it. Your children will inherit your position within it unless the pattern breaks. The pattern broke once before. War, depression, mass mobilization, and political pressure created the mid-century compression. Inequality fell. Ownership broadened. Mobility increased. The system lost leverage for 3 decades. The system learned. The system rebuilt. The system enclosed again. Understanding the structure is the first step. The documents are public. The data is accessible. The history is traceable. The names are known. The Federal Reserve surveys them. The Land Registry records them. The tax records quantify their gains. You learned feudalism ended because people with feudal advantages funded the institutions that taught you. The lie served their interests. The truth serves yours. The manor still stands. The rent still comes due. The question is whether you see the walls,